hopeful that everyone will benefit from, you know, the attention that it's been getting.
Well, shall we begin? Can
Yeah,
everybody
I'm
hear
all
me?
set.
Great, thanks. So my name is Felicia Chavez. I am what am I today? The Chief of Staff for the Buckminster Fuller Institute. And I'm kind of virtually seated over here off to the far right of our two speakers today. So I'd like to introduce Lionel, who is the curator of the. If I get this right, Lionel, you might have to correct me. I'm new to BFI in the past year, and just of course with the massive amount of Fuller material, I'm still learning all these terms. Is it the Synergetics website?
No, it's actually the Tensegrity Wiki.
Tensegrity Wiki.
There we
Great,
go.
thanks. So Lionel, if you could share a little bit more about that in case we have people today who are less familiar with that in a minute. And I just want to let everybody know, in case you don't know, that the Buckminster Fuller Institute is a membership nonprofit. And so we do have a membership program. Of course, you're all welcome to join that program. If you go to bfi.org, you'll see in the upper right a membership little menu item. And if you're already currently a member, of which most of you probably are, you can always email me, felicia@bfi.org, with any questions about your membership. And also, we have just changed platforms. So if you haven't re-signed up on our new platform, you'll need to do that to continue your membership. So, Faith, is there anything you'd like to add before we hand it off to our speakers?
I just wanted to say welcome and thank you for being here today. This is a really, really exciting conversation about the book, The Inventor of the Future, and also how that crosses over with Bucky's work. And I know, Lionel, you've been a part of the Institute for a long time and also a part of Trim Tab Book Club with Kurt McNamara and Alec. We've had multiple different conversations over the last several years, and yeah, just excited about this conversation. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be recording this as well, so others can watch it.
Yeah, great. And then also you may see Sam, who will be in the audience, and she's from Welo. So this is an experimental platform, and I just want to thank you, Sam, who looks like you're joining right now, for joining us today. In case there's any technical difficulties, you can right-click on her bubble, and if you're able to right-click and ask her help, questions, or certainly myself. And then Kurt McNamara, thank you for joining us today. And Kurt will be helping to manage our questions as they come in. The question submission area is the chat, just like in Zoom, in the bottom right of the screen. So there's kind of a little bubble you'll see in the bottom right, and you can submit your questions there. And with the help of Kurt, Lionel and Alec will work on working your questions in throughout. And then also at the end, for those of you who are available to kind of hang out and chat in the Welo space, you're welcome to do that after the formal event has concluded. So with that, I think I'll hand it off to you, Lionel.
Okay, thank you. Super excited to be here. Yes, I'm a fan and friend of BFI for a long time. I met Buckminster Fuller himself and studied with him and hung around the office. And I've just been involved for decades in his work. I see some old friends and some new friends in this audience. I'm just really happy to see Gary, Chloe, Tim Wessels. I don't believe we've ever shared a meeting together, so you're a name that I recognize. And with that, so it seems we have some long-term people. Buckminster Fuller is a person that has literally changed people's lives. He changed my life. And we're super happy to be interviewing Alec. And so, Alec, we actually didn't give you an introduction there. So can you just tell us about the one or two books you did before doing this biography?
Sure. So the most relevant, book on my resume is a book called Astounding. John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction, which came out in 2018. And the short version of this is that I was a longtime science fiction writer along with my other work, and I've always been intrigued by the history of the genre, and I decided to write a book that would look at one particular period in science fiction's history in America through the lives of four writers. and the book did fairly well. It had a good review. And as a follow-up, I was trying to figure out another subject, and Fuller to me was the obvious choice. Hopefully we can discuss this a little bit, in a minute. But my interest is really, how do we think about the future, and how do we prepare for it, and who do we look to for insights into what the future might look like. And Fuller, during his lifetime, was, I would say, the most famous futurist in America. He was certainly someone who was shaping that conversation for many years. And so when the time came to pick a follow-up to my first book, Fuller to me was, the best possible choice.
So you quote Fuller as saying, "It is one of the strange facts of experience that when we try to think into the future, our thoughts jump backward." And one thing Fuller talked about often when he spoke was, in 1927, this happened. In 1927, this happened. When I was born, there was no radio. Why do you think, Fuller, how do you connect the past and future? Can you speak about that?
So as a biographer, obviously, it's important for me to look at what Fuller says about his life and kind of where he situates himself, in the course of history. And Fuller is very, he's obviously forward-looking. He's famous for, being almost forward-looking to a fault, but also he is very backward-looking. He is very interested in unpacking his life story. And as you point out, he picks 1927 as a hinge point. You could say that 22 was a hinge point. You could say that a lot of moments in his life, were these events or these moments of insight, divide his life into periods, right? And to kind of tell his story properly, I found myself having to go, back to his childhood, obviously, his family history. His great aunt Margaret Fuller was, a hugely important figure in American history, and a very interesting figure when you look at her in light of her, great nephew's career. But yeah, no, I definitely found, a lot of insight into Fuller's remarks about looking into the past, as kind of a response to looking into the future, because I think that to understand his ideas, it's actually crucial to them into context, and his ideas, while incredibly innovative and singular, he's a very singular figure, they do have precedents, and they are rooted in particular projects and particular people, in particular phases in his life. And I think one of my goals with this book was to say, okay, here's an idea which is often taken in isolation. Here's where it came from. Here's what he was doing at the time. Here's what he had done beforehand and after that. And I think you actually do learn a lot about his ideas by, trying to provide that kind of context.
That must have been very difficult because he's a man of so many ideas. Just, I'll share with everybody, when Alec started out on this project, Jamie, Buckminster Fuller's grandson, at some point mentioned that he should speak to Lionel. Is that how it came about?
Yeah, no, that was exactly what happened. I said this to you the other day, but it's the number of people who have actually gone back to the archives, there are many Fuller fans, but, there aren't that many people who have engaged directly with the documents and the chronophile. And I think you and Bonnie DeBarco and a handful of other people, have really done that. And it was important for me to reach out to you because, we ended up following very similar paths, through this material. And I knew that your insights would be really valuable.
Well, thank you. And I'm trying to probe those together in front of this audience. So let's look a little closer. For example, one thing you mentioned to me was that Fuller seems to be like different people. I think you just said that a few minutes ago. We all change as we grow, and Fuller was working well into his 80s. So there are almost different Fullers. And I believe you mentioned when we were reading different versions of the books, and I was giving you notes, that most people knew the Fuller of the 70s and 80s, the Fuller of ideas. Whereas in our conversations, we spent all our time talking about the Fuller of the 10s and the 20s, the Fuller, that earlier Fuller. How do we distinguish between all these Fullers?
This to me is a key point, and I try to underline this whenever I talk about the book because it's true. I mean, most people who know Fuller either personally or through his work, encountered him in like what you might call the last phase, or one of the last phases. You know, he didn't really emerge as this sort of cultural phenomenon until he was in his 60s, I would say, the very earliest. You know, so obviously it's like your picture of him, if you are a fan, is kind of locked into this moment in his life, which was true of me. You know, certainly when I started this book, you know, I kind of had this, you know, very classic picture of Fuller, you know, this older guy in a black suit with the glasses and the hearing aids. And, you know, that image is powerful. But what, you know, I kind of realized very early on is that, you know, that old man is the product of a younger man. And you might even say several younger men, you know, and he arrives at a certain place at the end that is the result of the very different person he was when he was younger, you know, as a result of the mistakes he made, as a result of the wrong turns and the things that didn't work out. And I think, you know, again, as a biographer, you know, as opposed to a historian of ideas, you know, this is where I can kind of add value, you know, because very few people have gone back to look at those early stages, you know, in any kind of detail. And when you go there, you know, you kind of see these things about Fuller that are very surprising, you know, his ambition, his, you know, the way he treated his partners, the way he treated his family. You know, these are things that are, at first, they seem kind of incongruous with the picture of Fuller that we have at the end. But I think it's actually part of this continuum, or you know, there's a continuity there as well. You know, there are, as you say, like different phases that are in some ways very striking. But, you know, at every point, you can kind of see where he comes from, you know, where this version of Fuller comes from. And you know, it was only by kind of finding that chronology and starting at the beginning and treating every episode as if it were equally important, that I was able to kind of figure out, you know, so how do we end up with this figure at the very end who we think we know?
So let's look at one episode in particular, and it's one that you and I talked about quite a bit. It's the glowing sphere. Why don't you, because Fuller himself said that he said in many of his lectures that in 1927 he was thinking of doing away with himself. But he only very rarely, in fact, as far as I know, only twice told his son-in-law, the filmmaker, and a woman who was involved in more mystical types of thought, that he didn't just think of doing away with himself, that he actually had an encounter with a glowing sphere. And I recall that you and I debated about that. Why don't you speak to that? Because I do think many people are interested in what exactly happened to transform this man.
Yes. So this is a really interesting moment, obviously. And it's important to you know, point out that we're talking about two distinct incidents. All right. If you look at Fuller's comments on you know, this moment of insight, you know, it actually happens twice. The more famous one is the one that happens in 1927, and I think based on his diary and some other things, I'm fairly sure that we're talking about November 20th, 1927, which was a Thanksgiving weekend. You know, it fits the facts. It fits other details that I think from Fuller's life after that point that make me think this is the date. If it's not, you know, it's not that relevant, but I do think it happened, right? So Fuller obviously is someone who tends to mythologize these events after the fact. I do think at the very least he did go to the edge of Lake Michigan on a night, which I believe was November 20th, 1927, and had some kind of experience, all right? And the nature of that experience is, you know, only he knows what really happened, but he certainly treated that as a pivotal point in his life. And then a few months later, on a date that we can actually, you know, pinpoint very precisely, February 1st, 1928. You know, he is walking in Chicago, and he is on Michigan Avenue, and he's across from the Art Institute. And he says, and I'll read like sort of like the most fully developed version of this vision. He says, "I found myself with my feet not touching the pavement. I found myself in a sort of sparkling kind of sphere." And he hears a voice that says, "From now on, you need never await a temporal attestation to your thought. You think the truth." So this is, you know, quite an experience. And if you go back to his diary, because you can determine, you know, what date this was from other clues, all he says in his diary from that day is, "After much philosophical thought while walking about, worked out theory of spheres." So again, something happened, all right, and I cite his version. I also cite the version that he gave to Barbara Marx Hubbard, which it's interesting because he says that the voice said to him, "Bucky, you are to be a first mini Christ on Earth." And this, again, this is Hubbard's account. So again, you have different layers of attestation here. So, I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this because, as a biographer, again, all I can really do is lay out what Fuller said happened. I can lay out the facts that I can ascertain. I can say that he was on Lake Michigan probably on this day. He was on Michigan Avenue on this day, and something happened. And his account of it, it evolves, right? Not every version of the story is the same, but I think it's up to the reader to kind of sift through these different versions and kind of figure out, what seems the most credible.
So I also looked at that period of time very closely, and I'd like to share a few more details. Loretta Lawrence was the first scholar to try to unpack what went on in 1927, and she actually traveled there and looked at the rental records to see if he lived in a tenement and not. I personally found photographs of the Virginia Hotel where he lived, and it was rather luxurious. I spent a long time looking at that, and I agree with you that Thanksgiving weekend is extremely significant. Also because when he finally found his great-aunt's diary, she also had a mystical experience on a Thanksgiving weekend. And that's a startling occurrence and overlap. Do you want to speak about that? And then we'll look a little closer as to the other event in February.
Yeah, no, I think, you mentioned the Margaret Fuller's experience. And if you look at her memoirs, or, she has a very interesting account of an experience that happened to her on a Thanksgiving day. And Fuller would have seen this at that point. He talks about reading, there's a book called Margaret Fuller and Goethe, that talks about that incident. And it's pretty clear he had read that book around this time. So, it's quite possible that he was influenced by that account. The other thing that I find noteworthy is that the next day he starts looking for a new job. Okay, I mean, we don't really have time to go into the details about his work life at that point, but he had been fired from his job at Stockade. He had been trying to get back into it, but I think it's the day after this experience that he takes this first definitive step to move on. And I think that is also very, very, very significant. I think that, again, you can't really know what was inside his head at that time, but, you look at the context and the actions he takes. And, to me, that date really stands out as being one that makes sense. The last thing, which I think you and I have discussed, is that, it would be very difficult to commit suicide in the way that he is describing. All right. This is not a precipice that he's going to jump off of. This is the edge of a lake. And he says that he had the courage to swim out until he got tired and sank. All right. So this is not necessarily, I don't know whether he was actually feeling suicidal, how serious that impulse was. But, it's important to clear this up because, if he wanted to kill himself at Lake Michigan, it would have been very hard to do that.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time on that and found this isn't in the book, but there was a suicide bridge that was a matter of legend at that time because it had been torn down in 1919. But there was a suicide bridge over a nearby lagoon in Lincoln Park where he would take his walks. I do want to just connect for a moment. As we just said, people are drawn to Fuller because of his ideas and his work. And I myself personally, Kurt, and some of the people here and BFI are interested in codifying and continuing his work, which was really transformational. But as part of doing that, I personally, and now you as a biographer, became interested in what were the roots of that. What set me onto this research journey, which has taken decades, was to see, was there a Buddhist influence in those early readings? Because his current thought can be seen as having kind of what we simplify as calling Buddhist ideas, which means that there are intercooperating, non-trivial, opposite, co-creating forces that create the world, which is a kind of illusion, that there's an ultimate reality behind that. And I was just looking if he had actually read a Buddhist text, which I concluded that he had not. But he certainly did a lot of reading in the library after and during these incidents.
Yeah, trying to track, to trace his reading, is actually something that I didn't have a chance to do in as much depth as I wanted to, just because the time constraints on this project were, like I had to kind of pick and choose. But he does, provide a big reading list of the things he was looking at during that time. And another scholar who wants to tackle that, I think it would be a gold mine of information about where these ideas came from. The one that I did spend a lot of time thinking about is Le Corbusier's Towards New Architecture, which I chose number one because I knew the date on which he received it, so I could pinpoint that very precisely. And because the second you look at that book, you're like, this is hugely important for his development, not just because of the ideas, but he does draw on particular ideas. I think like the origins of the Demaxian car are here, and a lot of other concepts that Fuller later pursues at length. But also just the idea that this is the kind of person you could be. That you could be an influential architectural theorist without having to build anything. Because Le Corbusier at this point, he'd made his reputation using these ideas and images, and I think Fuller starts to work on these documents, that become Lightful Houses and Cosmopolitan Homes, and finally 4D Time Lock, these really singular, interesting documents around this time. And I think it's because he reads this book and says, this is another way forward. If I have trouble raising money to actually build these houses for real, in the meantime, I can use the Le Corbusier method and might write a manifesto that will get my ideas to the people that I'm trying to reach.
One other, by the way, that book is in a new edition, which was very helpful, and it makes it easier to read. Also, Le Corbusier talked about the similarity or the overlap of shelter with ship liners, airplanes, and automobiles, which is startlingly similar to Fuller's insights. So it seems that Fuller and Le Corbusier had simultaneously started focusing on these similarities, and of course Fuller took it to a very different place. Another book that Fuller read at the time, and he wrote it down, and this also we talked about and didn't make it into the book. By the way, I do want to share with everybody one common theme as Alec wrote this, as these different things would come up. He said, I need this to be one volume. So there were many topics that didn't get in. But there's a book that's forgotten today. It was extremely popular at the time. It's called The Man Nobody Knows by Bruce Barton. Bruce Barton is the advertising executive behind BBDO, and you could even say he's part of the inspiration in the popular series Mad Men. He was the son of a preacher, and he wrote a book about the life of Jesus called The Man Nobody Knows. And at that time, Fuller was a rather devout churchgoer. So we talked about that, yet it doesn't really show up in the book.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, like, as you were saying, I had to be very selective, and I don't think I even mentioned Barton at all in the book. He wasn't an earlier draft because Fuller writes to him. He actually reaches out to him, and we actually have his response. And I don't have it right here on me, but essentially Barton says, that there may be a point in this man's work, but I can't figure it out. I can't get past the language. But this is interesting, right? Because along with the list of books he read, we also have the list of people he tried to contact. So we're talking about people like Bertrand Russell, Christopher Morley, Henry Ford, Claude Brogdon, like a lot of, names that, again, like another scholar who has the inclination, this is a rich vein of material, to sort of figure out what was on Fuller's mind and what he thought was important.
Claude, Alec, you ran through a list of names there. They're each so interesting and important. Claude Brogdon, for example, had already icosahedra and polyhedra in his work because he was trying to solve the puzzle of ornamentation. In Fuller's time, buildings were heavily ornamented. They had statues of Greek wings. Grand Central Station, which Fuller's father-in-law, Monroe Hewlett, decorated the ceiling, a famous ceiling till today. You can see the constellations. That's by Fuller's father-in-law. There are winged seraphs in front, or Mercury, I think Mercury, the god of transportation. And Brogdon looked to geometry. So yes, there are important influences there. But then you mentioned Henry Ford. So let's move on to the businessman side of Fuller. He was very inspired by Henry Ford, who of course was a successful businessman, one of the most successful in history. But Fuller doesn't seem to, just had trouble doing business. We follow him through your book, establishing like 4 or 5 more or less traditional companies. And in fact, you start off your book with a metaphor about being a startup founder. Let's talk about Fuller the businessman for a few minutes.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question, because you refer to the metaphor of Fuller as a startup founder. And I think that's a great way of putting it. You know, as a biographer, I needed to find a through line. I need to find these things that you can use to kind of, you know, structure this narrative. And with Fuller, you know, there are many, many metaphors you can pick from. You know, like I think Jamie talks about the idea that, you know, his grandfather was a swimmer, or a sailor is another thing that, you know, Fuller talks about. You know, the idea that he is almost like an Odysseus figure is one that I thought about using as like a structural, you know, element motif. But to me, the startup founder one was really productive, because it speaks to today's reader, right? Because we know what this kind of person looks like. You know, I opened the book with you know, this one encounter between Fuller and Steve Jobs, you know, for a reason, because there is a certain kind of American protagonist that Fuller, I think, exemplifies. And it has gone by many names. You know, it has been referred to by many names over the course of American history. And the current incarnation, as I see it, is the startup founder. And if I'd been writing this book 30 years earlier, I would have picked something else probably as my metaphor. But I think it's relevant. And I think it's relevant because, as you say, Fuller does try to create a business in a conventional way, you know, by the standards of 1935. You know, he tries this, obviously, with the Demaxian car. He tries this with the Demaxian deployment unit. He tries this with the Wichita House, you know, and there are others. And this is, you know, this kind of is so obvious in his papers. You know, the stuff that, you know, I was most struck by is how much business correspondence there is of him, like talking to investors, talking to his business partners, you know, talking to lawyers, you know, in this like very pragmatic way, you know, in a way that I don't always associate with Fuller. And if this book is a thesis, it's that, you know, around 1947, 48, he realized that this was not going to work for him, you know, and we could go into the reasons why. You know, I think interpersonal issues come up, you know, to an extent that implicates Fuller himself, you know, as being just a difficult person to work with. And then around 48, he realizes that, you know, he can start this business using the Dome, which is a structure that he can build himself, or using college students. And he can kind of create this virtual corporation, you know, using the university system and these seminars he conducts, where he develops these ideas for 6 weeks with college kids, and then moves on to the next you know, college on his list. And, you know, he's still, you know, pursuing more conventional business opportunities, you know, and he founds companies, you know, that employ people who are more qualified to do this kind of thing, you know, than he is. But, you know, within a couple of decades, you know, he has kind of, I say this in the book, he's ephemeralized himself. He has become this corporation of one that can kind of get projects going, you know, based on his charisma, his, you know, personal impact on people, and his ideas, you know, especially the geometry. So to me, this is like a very interesting precursor to what we think of as the startup founder, you know, as the person whose message and whose public persona is as important as the ideas themselves, and raising money and finding customers. I think Fuller is doing this like in the 50s in a way that is incredible, and which is clearly an inspiration for the people that end up being the founders of Silicon Valley. So I think this is a really interesting point. And, you know, I was saying this to you the other day, you know, Fuller does not leave a big company behind him. He's not Don Richter. He is not someone who founds a dome building company. He is the company. He is the operation. And when he dies, you know, it actually ends up being very difficult for his successors to kind of keep that movement going, you know, in his absence.
That's a nice connection to who's hosting this event, the Buckminster Fuller Institute. And I do think you're absolutely correct. So to look at this a little longer, and from my personal experience, so I am a startup founder. I'm on my 5th startup, and this one we went public. And as I studied the early life of Fuller, one of the things that emerged early on was, at first, I was deeply moved by his origin story, so to speak. You know, he lost his daughter at 4. And then he was doing business and they threw him out. And this was so traumatic in the way Fuller tells the story. And one day it just dawned on me. I was like, that's normal to be thrown out by your board. Steve Jobs was fired by his board. Thomas Edison was fired by his board. Tesla was fired by his board. So that was a funny moment for me to realize that Fuller had turned into a traumatic event what's just normal in the course of doing business. A startup founder has to have magnetic charisma, an ability to convey a mission to his people, get the people working towards a goal, often with very little concrete reward, but promise of a huge reward in the long term. As we look closer at Fuller, you and I, and in your book, and people who read it are a little shocked to find that he's taking credit for other people's work.
Yeah, I think you and I discussed this, recently, and so this is another element in the pattern that I'm trying to talk about here, where Fuller represents a type. Okay, and I've heard people mention Steve Jobs as an analogy. I've heard people mention Walt Disney as an analogy, which I think is a really interesting comparison. And to me, yes. So these are people, mostly men in America, who are overseers, right? They are able to get things done. And I think, we talked about this, they're able to get things done to some extent under capitalism. And Disney clearly had, was much better at this than Fuller was. Steve Jobs was much better at this than Fuller was. Fuller never quite succeeded in creating this company in the way that these other men did. But, the pattern here is very clear. It's like there is someone who is able to start things. This is why we call them startup founders. They may not be able to finish things, and Fuller certainly had issues with that, but they can get the ball rolling. And Fuller does this many, many times over the course of his career. He gets the ball rolling in ways that I think are incredible. But yes, he does this in large part by using other people. He uses people who are available to do things he cannot do, either because he lacks the time or he lacks the training. He has engineers, he has architects. He is not an architect. He is never licensed. And so these incredible projects, things like the Montreal Expo Pavilion, he is not involved with the design or the engineering. He is the public face of this project. And I think for a lot of people, as you point out, this can be a very startling thing to realize, but it is entirely consistent with the kind of person we're talking about. And this is what still fascinates me about him, because I think the ideas, the artifacts are wonderful, and they're what drew me to him initially. But what keeps me, intrigued by Fuller is really the how. It's like, how did he do this for so long using, these resources that he had? And I think that is actually, the most instructive thing about his story. If I were a young person, trying to do things in the real world, his life is an instruction manual. It is a case study, and how this sort of thing is done. And it's important to, for that example to be useful, we have to talk about, the positive side, but also the negative side. What are the costs? What are the consequences? Because as you point out, the issue of credit and, other things did cause problems for him. And I think, for him to be a helpful, instructive figure, we have to be honest about those consequences.
I'm always very aware as we delve into his personal life or the people he slighted, that we're looking at a side of him that doesn't interest everybody. And so I just want to point that out. But it's very interesting to you and I, and we're going to stay on it for a few more minutes. By comparison there is, when you learn E equals MC squared by Albert Einstein, you don't need to learn that he married his first cousin. It's like two different worlds, and there's just no need. But with Fuller, he connected his personal life to his work. So let's stay for a moment on this businessman analogy. Now, we mentioned a couple of minutes ago that he didn't manage to found an institution. Now, Steve Jobs did. He founded a company that has become one of the wealthiest companies on earth. I will remind you, though, he was fired from that company in an absolutely traumatic period in his life. Walt Disney, you mentioned, and I have been seeking other business leaders who behave this way, who take credit from others. I'm just now reading the biography of Stan Lee, the creator of Marvel. And guess what? He didn't create Marvel. When you read this biography, you find out he ended up accruing all the credit of the comic book artists he worked with. Pardon, particularly Jack Kirby. So, and there's another comparison as well. I found another fella who ran into the same problems, Bill Gaines of Mad Magazine. And then I noticed a thread here. I mean, you did Startup Founder, and I think it works very powerfully. But he feels more like a publisher, because these are all publishers, Alec.
Yeah, no, I actually like that a lot, you know, and I think this is revealing too, because you look at Fuller's published work, you know, and he has this huge shelf full of books, but, you know, he actually wrote very few books in the way you think of, right? In the way of, you know, solitary, you know, hours at the typewriter. You know, he always had collaborators, you know, a lot of these works are either edited from his speeches or in a much more elaborate way with synergetics. You know, Edgar Applewhite essentially assembles this mosaic, this incredible structure that I can't recommend enough, out of, you know, thousands of pieces. And I always like draw this comparison between people like Applewhite and people like Shoji Sadao, who were indispensable. You know, these are people who Fuller entrusted with these massive projects that involved thousands of pieces that had to be assembled in just this right way. And in the end, his name's on the cover. You know, his name is attached to the result. You know, you could say that he could not have done this without these collaborators. But as you say, this is what publishers do. This is what producers do. You know, this is what, you know, company founders do. And, you know, I think we're talking about the same kind of person who is required to, you know, get these things done in, as you point out, you know, these very different fields.
And also, you know, I mentioned Stan Lee in comics. Walter Mosley wrote that Fantastic Four #1 crystallized an art form that has had an impact on our culture, rivaling jazz, rock and roll, and hip hop. It not only spoke to the young people of my day and later, it also helped to form them. And this is Fuller as a man of words, as a publisher. I can almost copy paste these words to Fuller. I published a short essay saying that tensegrity is like jazz and rock and roll, a uniquely American folk art. So staying on this idea of Fuller as a publisher, as a man of words, do you envy him at all? You're an author. Fuller seems to have done that trick of creating words. I mean, Joseph Heller created Catch-22. Fuller created tensegrity. Fuller took synergy, which was really a word from religious theological settings, and brought it into everyday usage. Do you envy that? Talk about how you see Fuller's work as an author, as a fellow author.
Right. No, that's a great question. And I think maybe this should be our last question for now. And we'll see if people in the chat want to like type up questions, or however we decide it's best to take questions from attendees. So there's a line I actually kind of regret cutting, you know, in the foreword to this book, which is that, you know, Fuller was this incredible source of metaphors. You know, this is kind of his greatest legacy to me, is that he produced all these ideas and words and invented a new language in a way that I think is very compelling. And you know, I kind of worry sometimes I underrate this, because I had to talk about so much other stuff in the course of this book. But, you know, things like Spaceship Earth, right? I mean, there's this debate about, oh, did Fuller really invent this term? And if you go back, you can find it used by other people. There's a count if you refer to the Earth as a sailing ship as opposed to a spaceship. But, you know, Fuller was using this metaphor as early as the early 50s, you know, long before it becomes, you know, popular. And there's no question that its use is overwhelmingly due to him. You know, and that to me is more important than, you know, did some other person say this at some other time? You know, it's Fuller who just goes with it and, you know, and runs with it. You know, same thing with synergy. You know, he did not invent the term synergy, but you talk about, you know, during his lifetime, you know, he would go to lectures and say, how many people in the room know the word synergy? And he would always say that almost no one raised their hand. And he would then explain to them what this word means. And now, obviously, synergy is almost like the epitome of the corporate cliche. You know, it has been so overused that it's lost all meaning, you know, and people are annoyed by how often they see it. And again, I think this is because of Fuller. I think he is this master of metaphor, you know, and he does this for decades. And, you know, I talk about this, you know, this kind of ties back into the startup founder, you know, analogy, because he is creating a corporate culture. he's dividing the world into insiders and outsiders. And one of the best ways you can do this is with language. And so you read Synergetics and you read a page of this book and you're like, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm intrigued. I want to know more. And there is a certain price that has to be paid by, the initiate who wants to enter this world. And, in Fuller's case, the price is you have to become comfortable with these sentences, with the syntax, with these incredible coinages that he is, coming up with, as early as the late 20s. I think Synergetics is probably my favorite Fuller book, if I had to pick just one, because I think he needed Applewhite to kind of give him the structure that, his work otherwise was sometimes lacking. And I think there was the sort of the combination of those two men, Fuller and, Applewhite, who is sort of his editor, but also his, sounding board. He's encouraging Fuller to develop these ideas together. The result is a real literary monument, and I know it's not for everyone. And I know that not every Fuller fan, would rank that, very highly in his works. But, that was kind of my entry point to him. And I still recommend that, as one of the first things people should look at to get an idea of who this guy was.
I smiled broadly when you said you've read it, because it stands like Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans or Thomas Pynchon's Finnegan's Wake. And I'm just trying to stick to the unreadable works of modern literature that people refer to without having read. It's astonishing that you read it. I know you're very eager to take questions, but I had been putting off talking a little bit about his marriage to Anne Hewlett. Why don't we take 5 minutes on that, and then we'll go to questions. So now here it's very personal, and in some sense I'm just prefacing with that because it's really going into a man's private life in a way that can be a little uncomfortable for me. But as I worked to help you, Alec, and gave you notes on the books, I was constantly writing more Anne. Where's Anne here? Where's Anne visiting her brothers? Just for the benefit of others. When Alec contacted me, I had been already 6 months interviewing one of Hewlett's granddaughters, a cousin of Anne's. And what I had been finding was that Anne had an extremely rich life with her brothers and sisters, and that they're all accomplished people to a different extent. I had been looking at the books that Anne read to her children. So Anne is the untold story here. And then your book comes up with all these other women besides Anne. So this is our 5 minutes on Fuller's marriage. Where do we start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I've been really gratified by the reviews and the response to the book so far. But very few people have talked about Anne, and I recall our discussions about this. You were very insistent that she be restored to the narrative whenever possible, and I agree. So they were married for 66 years, or almost 66 years, and they died, famously within 36 hours of each other. It's an amazing story. I encourage you to look it up if you haven't heard that story. And, to me is very intriguing because she's clearly an incredibly intelligent person. She's very gifted. She's a talented artist. She has had a good education, and, they are in love. Those early letters, they exchange are very powerful and very moving. And in the early phase of Fuller's career after 1927, she is his partner. You look at their diary, and they keep a shared diary. And he actually asks Anne, keep this diary so that we have a record of what we're doing. She is cutting out newspaper articles and magazine articles. She's going with him to meetings. They are brainstorming, creative ideas. And so she has this very important role in the first few years of his sort of what we think of as the modern, the sort of mature, stage in his career. And then later on, she kind of is not sidelined, but, they have a falling out, around 1929, let's say. And Fuller goes to New York City, leaves her behind with Allegra. And he, as you say, he has affairs. He becomes involved with a series of women, many of whom are much younger than he is, who are his romantic partners, but also his collaborators. Evelyn Schwartz is the first one that we know of, and she is there at his lectures taking notes. Frances Clow is organizing his papers, on his behalf. And finally, Cynthia Lacey, who is in some ways the most interesting of these women. She is his partner, his business partner, essentially, in Wichita for years. This is an incredibly close relationship, and she plays a huge role in the story of the Wichita house. And I think he loved all these women, especially Cynthia. And I always think about this because I think Anne and Fuller came very close to separating at least two different points, and they never do. And I always wonder about this because there is a certain pattern in the lives of men where they divorce the wife who was with them at the beginning and marry another woman who gets to know them after they've achieved their final form. And I see this again and again. And I think Fuller might have done this if the timing had been a little bit different. And this is like my own personal opinion. No one knows, for sure what would have happened. But I think that by the time Fuller found the dome, which was kind of the catalyst for this, amazing last phase, he was already 53. And I think he was maybe a little bit too old at that point to consider leaving Anne for somebody else. I don't know if this is true or not. But I do think that if the dome had happened in 1947, he might very well have divorced Anne to go with Cynthia Lacey. No one will ever know, but I think that's a very plausible scenario.
As I spoke to the Hewlett family, this is a very upper crust family. These are people who literally, there are towns named after them because they are the people who founded the town. There's Hewlett and Willets Point, Queens. Those are both in Anne's names. And they have some of the people they call horsey people. I never met these types of people, but those apparently are upper class people who like to raise horses and race horses, and they're members of the country club. So Anne and Fuller are members of the country club. Fuller is always a member of the Harvard Club, even though he constantly talks about not graduating. By the way, that's another surprise. I don't think it's in the book. Many of those boys didn't graduate in that time because the war came along, and it was just okay if you spent a few years at Harvard and then you went to war, you were considered a Harvard person. But Anne stands out. As I looked at these different lives, like for example, in Anne's debutante coming out, and yes, she was a debutante, and it's in the social register. She came out with 4 other girls, the Lane sisters, and Peggy, who actually became a model of a nurse because the pandemic happened at that time. Goodness, I promise this, I'll keep this short. So Anne stands out to me, Alec, in that she's content to live in an apartment in Queens, and then near the end in an apartment in a tower in Philadelphia, and then having those summers on Bear Island. I'm not sure people are fully aware, but there's no toilet facilities there. And if you look at Anne's particular background, the Rock Hall house also has almost no electricity. They were famous for putting, when they had all their parties there, everyone would wash the dishes. They washed their own dishes. So this is a certain kind of upper class woman. And my best comparison was to compare it to the late Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. It's also, the royal family has many affairs, many things outside of marriage, but they stay together.
Yes, maybe in close by saying, one of the few things I know about Anne for certain is that she was fascinated by the royal family, especially the Queen, and so I've thought about that a lot over the last week.
Beautiful. So, of course, we want to take questions. I don't see any questions in the chat. So does anyone have a question for Alec? And by the way, we don't have a hard stop, but we can go over a little. So if we have a few interesting questions, we can do that.
And let's check with Kurt, because Kurt, I know you've been attending to the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Lionel. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, very many useful links. So thanks to you who've been doing that to help the viewers see some backstory here.
So why don't we do this? I'll ask Alec another question, but please, everybody, if you have a question, why don't you type it in the chat, because we are eager to take questions. Alec, I was dying to ask this question. I'm going to share my screen. Well, please think of, if you have any questions for Alec, he's here. Why this photo?
Thank you. No, I'm delighted you asked that question. So this is a photo by Richard Avedon. All right. So one of the greatest photographers of the 20th century. It was taken in New York on October 28th, 1969. And it has never been published before, at least not in a book about Fuller. And, I'm not sure why this is true. I know that, you have to get the rights separately, from the Avedon estate, and you have to, you have to abide by their regulations. The reason why this cover looks the way it does is that you actually cannot modify the photo in any way. And so if you see a picture, if you see a biography that looks kind of like this with like a white cover and like a very stark looking picture of an Avedon portrait, that's the reason. There's a book by about Mccullough that came out a few years ago, a book about Sontag that came out recently. They all kind of like this, and it's because of the Avedon estate. So I chose this picture for a reason. And I actually talked about this. You know what? I'm actually going to grab a book off my shelf. I'll be right back.
And I'm reminding everyone, please, if you have a question, ask it.
So this is Buckminster Fuller's universe, which prior to this time, was probably the most comprehensive look at Fuller's life. And it uses this famous photo of Fuller in front of the Montreal Expo Pavilion. Okay, and this is actually a picture that has been republished numerous times. I've seen it, with reviews of my book. I've seen it with other articles on Fuller. And to me, this picture kind of represents Fuller as he wanted to be seen. He is kind of like the visionary staring off into the distance, right? And I was anxious to not use this picture because this is an obvious choice. The picture of Fuller that I used, of this amazing Avedon portrait, people have very strong feelings about it. They see that Fuller looks like he's got something to hide, or that maybe he is daring the reader to look further. And to me, it captured something about his personality that I thought was really intriguing. That captured some of the ambivalence that I feel toward Fuller, and that I think you have to feel once you see the whole story. So I was delighted that this photo was chosen because, and as far as like any one image can kind of encapsulate Fuller's contradictions, I think this comes very close.
So we did get a question. By the way, I agree. I find the photo actually disturbing. It's like he's hiding something. Questions are coming. So can you elaborate on Bucky's relationship with Don Moore? Don Moore was, I believe, a builder of domes. It was Don Moore Construction.
Yes. So Don Moore was an engineer with Whirlpool, and they met in Moscow during the 1957 American exhibition, where Fuller famously, there was a Kaiser dome as the main pavilion that Fuller was not directly involved in building, but he certainly showed up and was photographed there, and got the credit. And so Don Moore is a Whirlpool engineer who is also there because Whirlpool has a big exhibition, and he is laid off a few years later, and he contacts Fuller, and becomes, Fuller has a number of people like this over the course of his career who are engineers who can build things that he assigns to them. And so Don Moore, I would say for 10 years, let's say, would have built things like the Sunclips Dome, which was on Bear Island, I think, until it was destroyed. He pops up here and there doing research for Fuller, working on other projects. There's a really interesting interesting letter from Don Moore to Fuller where he talks about Douglas Engelbart's work, the man who famously demonstrated, hypertext and Windows and the mouse. Fuller was aware of, or at least Moore was aware of Engelbart's work and was giving Fuller information about this stuff. So, there are a number of people like this over the course of Fuller's life. I could name, 5 or 6 other people, Sadow probably most prominently, who are kind of his right-hand man. And I think Don Moore was that person for a period starting in the mid-60s.
A question just came through about Fuller and politics. The question says, to me, Fuller's strength was his vision to help humanity flourish by reforming the environment rather than through politics. When we talked earlier, it takes some kind of political maneuvering to keep your board in line to work in business. And Fuller's rather famous for saying, if all politicians disappeared today, the world would keep functioning. but if all the engineers disappeared, the world would fall apart. So do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so this to me is really interesting because, when Fuller emerges as a counterculture hero, okay, and this is something that happens like kind of unexpectedly in like the mid 60s and onward, obviously this is a time of immense political unrest and a period of, really notable activism among students. And he is not sympathetic to that approach. He does not think that protests are the way to change things. He says that students should, learn how to use their heads, and instead of treating them as punching bags. And this appeals to some people. Stuart Brand is, probably the most famous example, but someone who thought that you would have better results by following Fuller's advice and trying to change the environment, change tools, and not change human beings. And so, along with like the more famous sort of activist thread in the counterculture, like the free speech movement in Berkeley, you have this other interesting track that I think one of Brand's associates called the bailing wire hippies. These are people who are going out and building domes, and they are starting communes, and they're looking into solar power and wind power, and the whole of catalog, which I think is more responsible than anything else for Fuller's rise to fame at this period. That is the philosophy of the catalog. It's that you can change things by giving people access to tools and access to ideas. And I think it's very powerful, and I think it's a big reason why Fuller was so prominent and so influential in what became Silicon Valley. I think that was the perfect place for that philosophy to take root. I do think that it is incomplete, and I think that Fuller does not acknowledge the extent to which he was interested in politics, at least as a tool. He certainly goes after people in power throughout his career, and he has trouble building larger movements. And I do think that there are times that I wonder if he had not neglected that side of change, or that tool in the arsenal of people who want to make change, whether his lasting impact would have been different.
Like you've said, there's so much further research. By the way, I just want to point out in 2 minutes, we're at the end of our time, but we are freely going over. If somebody does have to leave, you can go ahead and drop. We were so excited. I was looking forward to this conversation for months, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. We will continue. So I think another work that somebody could do someday is Fuller's political abilities. I learned from your book, I had never fully realized that he had an ability to connect very well to powerful women, Claire Booth Luce, Indira Gandhi, and that's a pattern. I'm working my way towards a question here, but I do want to point out, when we earlier talked about Cynthia Lacey, Baby Chloe, and the women, sometimes I think, Alec, those were like collaborators with benefits, because he was just as intimate with Isamu Noguchi and Christopher Morley. He created these intense collaborative friendships. And once or twice, today we'd say, I'm not gay, or this is a bromance. But he does actually puzzle a few rare times. I'm so close to Christopher, but I'm not that kind of close. So just seemed he was I believe in one of our conversations, we said basically we didn't know he was such a stud. But let's
yes, I actually want to say, well, number one, I don't know how much further we're going to be recording, but I wanted to say thanks to BFI and everyone for coming out today. It was really fun, and I'm going to keep going for as long as you want to keep talking. Those two things are kind of connected. You mentioned like his ability to go after powerful women and these like close male friendships, and I think you've hit on something very fundamental about Fuller, which is that he was charismatic, and early on he does his best one-on-one. He does best by connecting to people individually, right? And so he has better luck with places like India, where he can go after Indira Gandhi and befriend her, and there's an obvious person in power to lavish his charms upon, right? And he has less luck in places like China, where there's no obvious person like that for him to go after. He goes after Imelda Marcos in ways that I think no one's ever talked about, which I think are really fascinating. But the same thing with Noguchi, with Morley. These are very powerful friendships. And as you kind of allude to, he uses this erotically charged language to describe these friendships. The way he talks about Noguchi as being this beautiful boy, and a lot of the language that Morley and Fuller, leave behind. I wondered, like what the nature of these friendships really was, and I can't really say anything beyond what is in the book. But there's no question that there was a powerful emotional component there that Fuller felt, genuinely, but that he was also able to use to kind of accomplish things. And I think that combination of, the genuine emotional and the pragmatic is there from the beginning, and you see it up through the very end.
So the question I was going towards is this one about computers and politics. Fuller thought that computers would be used to enable people to get the best information. Do you have any thoughts on how he would have reacted to all of the bad information on the internet?
That's a great question. So I thought about this a lot because it's very tempting to look at Fuller's view of what we call social media and access to information, as being ahead of its time. And I think it was. You look at, I think it's 4D Time Lock. He talks about, what we call remote working, remote education, in terms that I think are actually like pretty close to, what they became. You have this terminal, and, he's not really, he's a little bit vague on the mechanism, but later on he refers to television networks as being a way to get information, and you can call up documentaries on any subject, and you can look up, information when you want it. And instead of being, Fuller being someone who did not really enjoy the classes he took in school, he says, it doesn't make sense for us to, or he has a line where it says, not everyone is going to be interested in the politics of Venezuela at any one time, but you have to have the ability to look it up, to the moment when, that information becomes relevant to you. And this is a theme that is there, from the beginning. And yeah, I don't know if Fuller really thought through the implications of this, because there's an amazing line, and it's most famously expressed in 9 Chains to the Moon, I believe. But this idea goes further back. This idea that voting should be conducted on a daily basis. All right. So he says that instead of going to the polls, once a year or once every 4 years to elect people, we should have everyone be able to vote on policy every day or twice a day, and politicians will update their approach to things in real time based on public sentiment. And so he's essentially talking about surveys. He's talking about people expressing their opinions in real time, via some kind of two-way information network. And he believes that this will result in better policy. He says that, the majority will change its mind, or the minority will go along with the desires of the majority, and that the majority will change its mind quickly if it looks like, these policies are not working out. And I think this is not what actually happens. I think he is describing to me what sounds like social media. And I think he's a brilliant person. Obviously, the fact that he was even discussing this sort of thing in the 30s is amazing. But I don't think he foresaw the possibility that the kind of system that he is proposing here could be corrupted, or could become a way of accelerating misinformation and producing some of the less desirable consequences that we have seen.
I don't think any of us foresaw that, but I do think there's something reflecting Fuller's own political methods and how he looks at a world. He did see a world where everyone would be connected always. He was one of the first. In that first house, there's the information room. He doesn't even know what to call it, but he says there'll be a room where you can access all the world's information. And we certainly have that. But he does have a kind of naive faith that when everyone's connected and everyone's voting, it'll just be great. And I think that's also a California kind of idea. Nobody expected that the internet would unleash these communities of grievance that rally to destroy the targets of their animosity. There's a few more wonderful questions, so we'll jump around. This one just came in. Can you talk about the time when hotel rooms were Fuller's home?
So this is interesting as well. So Fuller, it's like kind of like a two-part question. So Fuller is obsessed by hotels early on, and hotels, railway compartments, and airplanes as design inspirations for the house, because he says that when we go to a hotel room, we are very aware of its design shortcomings, because we are experiencing these things for the first time. And so if I mean, speaking from experience, a hotel room shower, it's always confusing, and we're always annoyed by it, at least in my experience, and he says that we actually are less critical of the things that we see every day. So our houses, we're used to these things. And so we don't question the flaws in the way that our houses are designed, but we should extend the kind of critical scrutiny that we apply to things like hotels and railway compartments and ships and planes to the house. Okay. That said, later on, as this question implies, he does increasingly live on the road. He lives in hotels because starting around, I would say, the mid-50s, early 60s, he is earning most of his money from lecturing and from doing these events. And, he is this, I say in the book, whatever money comes in, it almost immediately goes out again because he is spending money on his staff. He is spending money on research projects. And so he kind of ramps up his lecturing schedule to this incredibly intense, sort of itinerary where he is almost always on the road. He is not living in that famous dome house in Carbondale. He is, I would say, doing hundreds of events every year. And he is living in hotels and living on planes and living on trains. And I think this actually does affect his ideas. I think, as I said, this theme is there from the beginning. But, pragmatically speaking, Fuller is always living, in the state of transit. And to him, this becomes his natural environment. He actually makes certain life changes to make it possible for him to live, as a constant traveler. The one reason why I think geometry becomes such an important part of his life later on is that, he can carry that in his head. He doesn't have to bring a big suitcase of stuff anymore on the road. He can just think about geometry and, a piece of paper and some notes is all he needs. And, his ideas about the world are mediated by the experience of being in hotels. And this is something that I actually discussed in an earlier draft and I cut. He is a world traveler. He goes to incredible, numbers of countries and, travels, as he says, millions of miles, over the course of his career. But, these are mostly very stage managed events. He's going to conferences, he is going to trade shows, he is going to events that, require him to go from the plane to the hotel to the convention center. And so, his sense of geography, becomes a little bit limited, even when he is traveling across the world. The physical environment that he finds himself in, is not radically different, than it is when he's staying at home. And I'll close this by saying that, he referred to his Carbondale house as his private hotel. He saw it as a hotel he just happened to own where he would stay when he was at SIU.
A question here. To me, Fuller's strength was his vision to help humanity flourish by reforming the environment rather than through politics or other means. Do you agree?
I kind of got at this in a previous question. I think this is a huge part of his appeal, right? I think if you are a young person, especially, and you are drawn to this idea of design, as a way to solve problems, he is the ultimate source of inspiration. I am a little bit skeptical of it. I have to be honest, all right? And this is my personal opinion. I spent a lot of time reading science fiction, thinking about science fiction, and how science fiction of a certain era solves problems. And I do think that there's a tendency for science fiction to fall back on engineering, as a way to solve problems. And occasionally, science fiction writers or people like John W. Campbell, try to enact this in the real world. And you often find that it doesn't work out the way you intend. These technological solutions have surprising consequences. We talked about what happens with social media, and as Lionel pointed out, very few people could have seen that coming. It is true that inventions can change the world, but the unintended side effects, what Fuller would call the externalities or the processional effects of these things, are very hard to anticipate. And so I think that his point of view is incredibly interesting and valuable. I think it's been hugely influential. I think it essentially is the philosophy that technology has adopted, to advance its objectives. But I do think it's incomplete, and I think that Fuller is one person I take a lot of inspiration from, but he's not the only one. And I think his philosophy, his vision of how the world needs to be enlarged and supplemented if it's going to be useful.
I'm going to take another question. This has been so wonderful. I just want to remind people we're talking to Alec Nevala-Lee. His book, Inventor of the Future, about Buckminster Fuller is what we're talking about, but we've mentioned his previous book, Astounding. Also, Alec has written great science fiction books, The Icon Thief, which mentions the work of Marcel Duchamp, and City of Exiles, which is based on the Dyatlov Pass incident. One of the wonderful things in my life to meet Alec is all of these things are interesting to me. I know way too much about Duchamp, just as I know way too much about Mr. Fuller. Actually, that's not a question, but can you speak for a minute? Fuller and Duchamp are in New York at the same period, but they don't cross paths.
I love this question. I don't know how interesting this will be to most people here, but I spent a lot of time thinking about Duchamp, and I think these two men are very similar in certain ways. I think they've become very self-contained in ways that I find fascinating. The idea that this is, Fuller's virtual corporation, is a theme in this book. And I think Duchamp, was kind of like a movement of one, and he was very, he lived like a monk, right? He didn't have a lot of physical needs, sort of like Fuller claimed to be. And, you have this life of incredible purity, where, with Fuller, it's very clear that he chose this path because it gave him more flexibility. It allowed him to pivot very quickly between ideas and projects. And I think you see something very similar with Duchamp. I think it's a question of, there's a great line that I think I quote in my novel where Duchamp says, it's just a question of knowing what you're living for, what to live for, and you simplify your life accordingly. And I think he is a fantastic example, and I would love to see maybe Calvin Tompkins could do this, like a in-depth comparison of these two men, because you have these men who are essentially contemporaries who are living this life of radical simplicity in some ways, and use that to build these artifacts that change things. And I think there's a lot to be talked about there that someone, besides me, perhaps, should explore further.
Duchamp also ephemeralized in the way he made the suitcase, which were small models of his artworks. Going back to a question, he actually, sorry, it jumped. Here it is. He actually always, from 1928 onwards, thought that man needs to be mobile, right?
This is a great question because, yes, so on the one hand, you have Fuller, as early as like the late 20s, he is talking about decentralization, right? He's talking about, so I mean, to back up one step. So his idea in 27 is to build a house that can be manufactured in a factory and then delivered anywhere in the country. And this is an idea that comes out of his frustration from his previous job at Stockade, where he's building these houses by hand, essentially, and never sees momentum. And he says to himself, the way to really scale up is to do this like mass-produced house. And I think his idea about decentralization almost comes out of the house, not the other way around. I think he arrives at the house first and says, how do I sell this idea? How do I make it seem like something that people will want to buy? And he says, well, mankind is becoming more decentralized. We are spreading out. We are, in a place, as I mentioned earlier, where we can use the tools of remote learning and remote working, so that we can live anywhere. And he talks about this for individuals. He talks about this for education. He talks about this on how you would run a company. He says that it doesn't really matter where you are. You can place orders and, conduct business from anywhere. So this is like there in 1927, 28, which is, to me, incredible. And, later on the dome becomes this, what he calls a super camping structure. It's there are also previous ideas like the utility, what's it called again? It's like this like trailer that you can drive anywhere to like a campsite that has all the things you need. And the dome, is sort of a version of that, later on. And again, these are things that he uses because they justify these artifacts, these ideas, you know. And he says later on that this is a Cold War strategy, that dispersal and, you know, is like a defensive, you know, response to the threat of nuclear war, because you can't aim at the city if there's no city, if everyone's like spread out far enough, you know. And this is, he's not alone here. This is a huge trend in Cold War strategy. But the one thing I wanted to quickly mention, you know, so decentralization is a huge part of his career. I think it's a beautiful idea. And then later on, you see him also proposing these mega structures. Okay, he proposes this tetrahedron city. You know, he proposes these, you know, the dome over Manhattan. He proposes Old Man River City, you know, in East St. Louis. These like huge domed, you know, structures, and you're like, why is he doing this? Because it seems like the opposite of decentralization. And again, this is me as a biographer. I think that it was very practical. I think he knew that he could get press coverage from these renderings. I think he realized the power of conceptual art to depict these incredible ideas that would get attention, even though they were philosophically in contradiction to his actual beliefs. I think he saw them as a way to, you know, raise money and get attention that he could not do if he was simply being consistent with his themes of decentralization.
Dr. Martin Rayala adds in the chat, the post-war period with cars and interstate highway development were all part of this mobility aesthetic. See the USA in your Chevrolet. Jimmy.
Oh, actually, you know, I do want to add one more thing, and this helped me understand the Demaxian car, because I never quite understood where this car came from. And you know, the answer to me is that, you know, Fuller saw the car as a piece of the house that could drive away. You know, it was a mobile front porch. So, you know, to have a house that was truly decentralized required this piece that, you know, was also a vehicle.
Jimmy or Jim Ice, Alec, did you happen upon any reference in the files that remarked on Fuller's 10-day presentation in Florence, Italy in 1978 at the World Congress?
You know, that's a good question. You know, I have all my information right here. I don't have it in my brain at this second, but if you give me 1 second, I can look it up. I can multitask a little bit. So the one thing that ended up being indispensable in writing this book was Fuller's itinerary. And I think, Lionel, you looked at this this document as well. You know, this is an incredible document that is, you know, thousands of pages long, that essentially, you know, tells you where he was, you know, certainly from the 60s onward on almost every day of his life. And, you know, as a biographer, you're like, what an amazing tool, but it's overwhelming. You know, the number of events he flew to, the number of conferences he attended, the number of talks he gave, you know, I mentioned a few of them in this book, but it is like, I would say 2% of, you know, the things he was doing toward the end. So yeah, so if I don't mention a particular event, even one that I think was very interesting, it's, as you say, you know, the need to keep this book within one volume, you know, was pretty overwhelming. So what was that date again?
World Conference, Italy, 1978. World Congress, Florence,
1978. I do have this, yes. So I have it. He arrived in, you know, Rome on February 17th, 1978. Went to Florence for the World Congress of the New Age. So if you want more information about this, okay, so we have the dates. We have the archives at Stanford, and we have a finding aid. And so the finding aid at Stanford is pretty comprehensive. And at this stage, you know, early on, like the files are a little bit hard to organize, or hard to, you know, work through. But toward this point, you know, it's all chronological. So it's actually not that hard to go to his archives and find the box, or probably in this case, multiple boxes that cover this time period. And you would find, I'm sure, you know, tons of information about this event, you know, without having to go through the entire chronofile. So, you know, if you want to know more about this, I definitely recommend, you know, going there in person and trying to dig up some of those files.
A reminder again, thank you all for even staying. We're way over. I think, why don't we just shoot in 10 minutes, up and half? Yes.
Sorry, can we ask one more question from George Orbelia?
No, we're staying, but I'm proposing that we really wrap up on the half, although I could even stay longer. I love talking to Alec, and I love talking to all of you. I do want to say one more thing. Again, I mentioned that I also run a business, and one thing very important in our credit card processing was the ability to process renewals. And BFI didn't set up their credit cards that way. So all of the people who joined now have to be asked to rejoin. And we also have a saying, every click, you lose half your audience. So BFI is really facing a kind of catastrophe. So I'm going to ask everybody watching this, and if you're watching this as a recording or listening as you're jogging, go to bfi.org and join. And hopefully by then BFI will have the renewal process set as well. It's money well spent. It's the one organization that is really working consistently day after day, week after week, to further Fuller's legacy and allow an agora where people interested in Fuller can gather.
And Lionel, thank you for making that plug. I appreciate it. This is Felicia again. And so just to clarify for a moment, we do have credit card renewals on a monthly basis for those of you who are ongoing members. But as Lionel mentioned, we did change our platform in the last several months. And so that means if you were a member up until August 1st, right around there, then you will need to sign up on our new website. So thanks for mentioning that, Lionel.
There's so many wonderful questions. I'm going to answer one and then tee up one for you. Did Walter Gropius, who was on the board of Black Mountain College, mention the Zeus Dome to Bucky in 47 or 48? So historians of the dome, and I'm one of them, did look very closely at the Zeus Dome. And no, it doesn't appear that it crossed Fuller's radar at all. And there are differences in the geometry, by the way, subtle differences, which are also intriguing. Now back over to you, Alec. Here's a question from George Orbelian. As humanity faces ecocide, is there any other single person who has shared more relevant information to serve our collective future?
So this is going to be a controversial response. I think the answer maybe is no. And and again, like this is not, this should not reflect anything but my own personal opinion. I think that the challenge now is not so much big ideas. I think we have like a surplus of big ideas, many of which are useful and relevant. I think the challenge now is mobilizing and organizing like collective people, like movements of people. And I think in the book I say this, like Fuller is an incredible, model, and I think a great case study, someone I, refer to a lot and who could be incredibly useful to the right person, who wants to make change. But I also think that, I say this in the book, that our ideal should be a world in which the figure of the comprehensive designer is not needed, that we don't find ourselves relying on these charismatic individuals, to kind of tell us what to do. And what that looks like, I'm not sure. I think and again, this is my personal opinion, I think we're in a state of transition right now. I think that the big idea is a thing that is less important than enacting these things in practice. And that's the hard part. And it's not glamorous. It's not as exciting as, the sort of ideas that someone like Fuller can convey to us. But I think it's more important. And I think that's where the future of, this world lies.
Alec, you're a deep thinker and so candid. Certainly Fuller did not talk about that, but I personally also agree with you. I find that Bowling alone said it. We don't know how to talk to the person next door. We've ceased talking to each other. And Fuller is no help in this regard. In fact, he says politics is not needed at all. Just change the tools. And we certainly need political and social skills to talk to each other and to organize and get active on our local community boards and our local municipal boards, or even just your co-op board, which most people run away from those tasks. Okay, a question, a really interesting one from William Meyerhoff, who is, by the way, a very old Fuller person, and he asks, what is the origin of the idea of water people versus land people? In other words, water people is a world of cooperation, land people a world of competition.
So this is an interesting question. So if I understand this correctly, this is referring to Fuller's theory of history, which is something that I treat in about a paragraph in this book because I just didn't have room to get into it. But this is what is eventually known as the Naga story. And this is a story that Fuller, I want to say, starts developing in the early to mid 60s. And I think it's actually like a consequence of his travels. I think he is absorbing information, as he encounters it. in his travels. And he is this, he has this kind of interesting mind where he, at this stage, he is not necessarily like a systematic reader, but he will sort of chance upon these tidbits of information that he will then assimilate into this like big picture. And I think the best summary is probably the one that Calvin Tompkins provides in his New Yorker profile of Fuller in the outlaw area, where he talks about, and I don't have the specifics, readily at hand, but yes, there is this distinction that he draws between the people that set sail, the navigators and the seafarers, who are not satisfied with the situation on land, and they enter the sea, the outlaw area, where they develop technology and ideas that they then bring back to the people who stayed behind, or they start new societies. And if you want to read about this in great detail, the book Tetra Scroll, talks about this a lot. There's a whole book called Naga that Sumet Jamsai, one of Fuller's collaborators, worked on years after he died. And again, like the most tactful way I can put this is I think I lack the qualifications to have a reasoned opinion about this story. I do not believe that it is mainstream within the fields of anthropology or archaeology. I would be skeptical of the particular claims Fuller makes about history, because this is not his area of expertise. That said, as a metaphor, it's amazing. It's an incredible metaphor, and I think he believed it. And I think that there is a lot there that is useful and interesting to think about. I just want to make sure that we are cognizant of the difference between a work of history that is based on actual research and sort of this, I'll call it a myth that Fuller invents and elaborates, to convey certain ideas that are important to him.
And by the way, I want to point out, Alec looked up one thing in this conversation. It's extraordinary that you, what you do remember, and you actually claim to have read all of Fuller's books. I was skeptical. I tried to read Synergetics 1 and 2, and how did you do it?
Well, I'll tell you something. Okay, so the first year of this project was devoted to reading. Okay, 12 months to work through Fuller's books. As many of the articles and lectures as I could find, and the letters. 12 months, one whole month was devoted to Synergetics 1 and 2, to 2 books. The majority of, you draw like a pie chart of the time I spent on different works, and that was the one I spent the most time on. And I can't say I understood all of it. After a certain point, after reading the same page a few times, I was like, the odds of this actually being relevant to my book are very low. So I'm going to move on and kind of make a note of it, maybe go back to it someday. I can't say I read all of Fuller's published work because there are tons of speeches and articles that, I probably didn't get a chance to get around to. I will say that after a certain point, he does repeat a lot of the same ideas. Right. To me, it was important to get the chronology and to show how the ideas evolve. But after 1965, 1970, if you've read one Fuller lecture, you've kind of read them all. And in my case, just reading the Everything I Know lectures, which he gave in 75, that to me was kind of like the other really crucial piece, because it's like the epitome of everything he had to say at that point in his career. And so I think, and I'm sure there are things I haven't read that are very interesting and useful, but, I think I got 90% of the way there by doing the kinds of reading that I actually did do.
Tim Wessels asks, Fuller seemed to have a large, I just have to ask you one question. How do you read so much? I get stir crazy. Do you just sit? Do you sit on a bicycle? Do you stand?
Yeah. I mean, having a deadline helps, because I knew I had basically 2.5 years to write this book. And if I didn't start writing by, January of 2020, which ended up being a pretty wild year, for other reasons I couldn't have expected, I wouldn't have finished it. So I knew I had 2019 to read all these works. And so that was a big motivator. That said, I will say that I forget a lot, and taking good notes is key. I definitely had to take an incredible number of notes, not just for the books, but for the correspondence, every letter, I never knew what was going to be useful later on. And so every letter, even like the laundry bills and stuff that I found in Fuller's Chronophile, I have a note there, because who knows, maybe someday it'll be important to me to know that he had his laundry done in Buffalo, New York in 1932. Stranger things have happened, and so I can't take credit for anything except maybe like good note-taking skills and a decent intuition about what future me is going to find useful a year from now or longer.
Well, I think you're being modest. It's quite extraordinary capacity you had to absorb all that. A question from Tim Wessels. Fuller seemed to have a large network of people in an age without social media. How did he do it?
That's a great question as well. Well, I mean, Tim would know. He worked at that office. Fuller definitely benefited from having a capable staff. You look at his correspondence and he saved everything. He was getting letters from all over the place, and just keeping track of these things. There's a huge card file of correspondence that his staff kept that I've glanced through, and it's remarkable. So yes, it's all on paper, right? Which is amazing in itself. I think about this sometimes where, people refer to like the world's biggest archive. The chronophile is the world's biggest archive. And I think that might be true. But I also think that, if you took my Gmail account and printed out every email I've ever received that I've saved, over the course of the last 15 years, it would be thousands of pages. And I think Fuller is unique in that he actually tried to do that when you didn't have digital technology. You didn't have scanning. So you had, had to deal with tons, literal tons of paper. I will say that Fuller, he did have a lot of contacts. My understanding is that with him, it was often very transactional. So his he would have great interest in particular people who were useful to him at a certain point. You see him going after people like Imelda Marcos, very thoroughly. Other people he kind of encounters in passing, and they reach out to him later on. He's important to them, right? And Fuller had this amazing ability to change someone's life after passing through it for a day or two. Or for the space of a lecture, okay? And some of those people become, important later on. People like Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand, to my knowledge, he really only met Fuller a few times. They did not spend a lot of time in the same room, and the correspondence between them is pretty limited. But Brand is the kind of guy who can just go off and do his own thing. Maybe he gets Fuller's blessing, but he does not need Fuller's attention. And this is true of a lot of people who are part of this network. But Fuller is not the one actively maintaining these relationships, unless they are a head of state or unless they are the head of a company, or unless they're paying him money. He is relying on them to stay in touch. And you kind of see this pattern again and again, where people, or even like Lloyd Kahn of Shelter, he crosses paths with Fuller, does his own thing, and Fuller, pays attention to these side projects, to the extent that he needs to. And this is something that you see in the 70s, but also in the 50s. There are different branches of the Fuller Research Foundation, and they're all kind of doing their own thing in Chicago and Canada, and yeah, he kind of keeps tabs on them, to the extent that he can. But yeah, there is a touch of anarchy to it that I find really fascinating.
So to wrap up, I'm going to mention David Mccullough, a beloved biographer who recently passed away. He said, "People often ask me if I'm working on a book, but that's not how I feel. I feel like I work in a book. It's like putting myself under a spell. And this spell, if you will, is so real to me that if I have to leave my work for a few days, I have to work myself back into the spell when I come back. It's almost like hypnosis." This book was a labor of years. It's still clearly with you. Tell us, what is your fond hope that this book will bring to its readers? And what has it brought to you?
So obviously this book is designed to reach different kinds of readers. Okay. And that was one of the challenges I had. It had to be a book that could be accessible to someone who was encountering Fuller for the first time and had no idea who this guy was. And also to the obsessive Fuller fans who are going to ask me about about this conference in Florence, 1978, do you ever talk about that? Which I understand, everyone has their own Fuller, right? And I love the sort of deep dives, the obsessive fans that I encounter. So because that's a two-part audience, it's a two-part answer. So on the one hand, I want this to be a book that scholars can use. I once referred to this book as an index to the chronophile. So if you want to look into another project that Fuller did, maybe I have half a page about something that he did that's interesting to you. You can look at this book and figure out, where to look, what he was doing before and after, this project happened. and maybe go from there and fill out that piece of the story. Because the one thing that was missing from the fuller scholarship that I'm glad this book is helping to fulfill is that timeline. The timeline here is so complicated and so daunting that it was a huge challenge just to kind of get the chronology right. And this book to me is like, the minimum length I could get to convey that. So if you're a fuller scholar, I really hope you start with this book and kind of like use that to provide context. And part two is that, I really hope that people use this book as I say, like a manual. If you are a young person and you want to do things, in the world in the way that Fuller did, he's an amazing example. As long as you understand the downsides. He tells you how to do it. He documents every step of the process, and there's more information about him than there is about almost anybody else, in this category. So if you are young and ambitious and, want to be the comprehensive designer, like here it is. Like this is how he did it, and it's often like very different from the version that you see in his work. The version that you see that he is authorizing toward the end of his life is it's idealized, right? And I know that person is very inspirational to people, including me. But pragmatically speaking, when you look at what he actually did and how he did it, there are incredible insights here and incredible tools here that you don't find in his work.
So thank you, Alec. That's Alec Nevala-Lee. I recommend Inventor of the Future, which we've been talking about here at BFI, and his previous book, Astounding. It is astounding what I learned there about the progenitors of science fiction. BFI is the place to have events like this. I attend all kinds of Fuller discussions, but I have to say this was really a good one, and it's just an indication of what BFI does. So please go to bfi.org. and join if you're interested, and you could have more events like this, such as Unearth Regenerative Potential, Regenerosity, and all kinds of ways that we're coming together to continue Fuller's work. With that, I'll stop leading the conversation, and
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes,
thanks, Lionel.
Thank you, Lionel. Thanks, Faith and Felicia. This was really great. And I wanted to say I didn't quite finish answering Lionel's last question, like what do I want to get out of this book? A lot of things, obviously, but the main one is access to people like the ones who are here today. This community fascinates me. I want to be a part of it. And I encourage people, if you can find me online, please reach out. I want to hear your stories. I want to hear your questions, because, this is a big part of this project. The book is out in the world, but this is just the beginning, and I expect to be a part of this community for a long time to come.
Great, thank you. And I invite everybody, if you'd like to unmute yourself using the little panel at the bottom of your screen. On the far left, there's a little mic icon, and clap for our presenters today. Thank you. And this is the experimental Buckminster Fuller Institute Welo. You may have never seen it before, so thank you for working with our new technology. And you're welcome to hang out in the bleachers here or check out the other spaces. It's open 24/7 on an experimental basis. And yeah, thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
So you don't have to run off. You can stay and chat with other people if you feel like it.
Yeah.